So I guess the simplest way to say the reason I got involved within climate activism, I guess is the same for everyone. At its core is I'm a human being and I wish to live on a planet that is sustainable, that is habitable, but also recognizing just how deeply climate activism is, how deeply it's about an issue of justice. So I'd spent some time working with Friends of the Earth International just prior to the release of the IPCC 1.5 report. And part of my role was kind of looking into the details of that report, but also in collating case studies from their work. So they're an international organisation covering 75 nation countries, majority of them based in the global south. So communities directly at the forefront, at the brunt of climate impacts. And so in the process of collating those case studies, some of them were around extractive projects in areas like Bangladesh, and seeing the kind of impact that these projects had in detail, like on the local community. So looking at through transcripts of activists that had been there on the ground, people from the local community, interviews that had been carried out, and seeing like how the local fishing community wasn't able to fish and for their sustenance due to like the impact that this project was having in terms of the high level of pollution and the impacts on health that had on the local communities. And just kind of, I guess, the impacts went on and on in terms of how directly people were being impacted. And obviously the local communities, the country as a whole, had no benefit in terms of any wealth or any income generated from this project. It's just the classic tale of colonialism, of capitalism, seeking to extract more and more from an earth, the idea of infinite growth on a planet with finite resources, and the idea that the air we breathe has no value, the water and it's polluted, without which we cannot survive, has no value, the lands upon which we live, our communities, are all affected by this, and seeing how deeply it's an issue of justice. And that kind of really motivated me to really get more involved in kind of challenging these systems of oppression that are ongoing. In terms of people that have greatly inspired me within the movement, I'll share two. So one is somebody called Asad Rehman, kind of terms himself as a general activist against all bad things, which is very true. Quite a leader in terms of activism around Black Lives Matter, against racial injustice, in terms of workers' rights, in terms of climate justice, both at the international level and more the local level as well. And generally, from what I've seen, like whenever he speaks, he's often like the lone speaker, kind of highlighting the reality of a situation rather than joining in with all the other NGOs that I see kind of celebrating, like, okay, another incremental, minute action that the government might have conceded to take after so much pressure that has been placed on them. And they'll jump in and say, yes, this is great. It's another tiny step forward. But he would kind of highlight, not in terms of a negative sense, as he has like a very like beautiful vision of what the possibilities can be, but in terms of being radically honest and realistic about what these actually mean, and the fact that it's simply trying to obfuscate what the actual reality of these solutions is. I think George Monbiot recently wrote an article sharing like a similar sentiment and saying like that the often like the government's so-called environmental policies aren't just useless, but they're dangerous in trying to distract us from the actual reality of what the kind of impacts would be. But the other inspiration is a US-based essayist called Mary Hegler. I recently met her at something called the Climate Story Lab just prior to the pandemic, which was held in London. And so the idea was that it would bring a whole bunch of climate communications professionals and activists together in one space. As one of the key issues that we face, like as a movement, is the idea of how do we communicate on this issue? Do we frame it as an issue of like urgency, of anger, of hope, of courage, of like guilt, of despair? Like how are we speaking about this? How are we framing it? And the idea is that we need to frame it in a way that gets people to recognize like the urgency and like the widespread kind of implications of tackling this, but also in the possibilities of hope in terms, and the courage and the kind of anger, all of this that we need in order to move forward. But she's written a very beautiful essay, which I recommend everyone to read, called "But the Greatest of These is Love," and that kind of taps into the idea of seeing that yes, all of these different emotions that we feel like are natural, but they fail to encompass and get to the root of the truth of what we really feel, and that is love. And that's a love centered on justice, a love that seeks justice, a love that can spark a movement, a love that can sustain a revolution, and that is a kind of love through which we act. And she also reminded me, because one thing, like I really hate public speaking, like I'm very nervous and very shy and very much an introvert, so I very rarely say yes to an invitation to speak, and often pass it on to somebody else who can say things better than I can. But she also reminded me to kind of speak our truth with conviction. And so there is sometimes a need, even for myself, to speak in these kind of spaces, and to kind of share the I guess, bring something to the conversation that others might not necessarily bring, but also seeing that it's not, also questioning the reason why we speak, why we share ideas like this. And I guess one of the things I've generally inspired have been TED Talks, the idea that these ideas can spark a whole new way of seeing the world, and that beautiful ideas that have been shared and that have inspired millions of people that have heard them. And so I thought this kind of space with the TEDx talk is something that, one, I'm really keen to hear the ideas that others share, but also kind of share my own ideas in terms of getting to the root of the issue, not kind of obfuscated by any kind of the language that we use, but kind of getting to the heart of the idea that this is about justice, that we're here because we are human beings, and the fact that we can see how interconnected we are, like through this pandemic, but also how much, like individually and collectively as a whole, how much we stand to change as well. The way that, in terms of who's being excluded from these spaces, when people are highlighted, when climate issues are spoken about and communicated, when activists might be profiled by the media, even then, like the language that they use and the way in which they profile activists, particularly activists of colour, is still very much whitewashing them, and kind of taking away their sense of agency in terms of what they've done. So just one small example would be an activist called Maya Rose Craig, better known as Bird Girl. So she's really inspiring young activist, very active within climate activism. Has seen, like, I think about half of the world's birds, and has founded an organization called Black to Nature, which is designed to enable visibly minority ethnic individuals to access nature, to go bird watching, to kind of go out into spaces of nature which they don't generally get to experience. And she's recently been signed on to publish a book. And so there was a news article about her and like kind of celebrating this fact, but the headline is just very telling, and just describing her as a UK's Greta rather than describing her as her own person. This is no shade on Greta Thunberg, who's a brilliant activist in herself and often uses her platform to kind of to likewise like highlight these issues of systemic racism and oppression. But the issue is that in terms of the UK media and elsewhere, the fact that they choose to highlight individuals who have been doing the hard work for many years, the fact that she's founded this organization because she didn't see people like herself represented in the spaces where she was. The brilliant work that they do is distracted from, and so many different ways of engaging in activism, whether through creative actions or direct action. There's a whole host of issues in terms of like representation, but also avoiding tokenization as well. I'll just give one example of one concrete way that, as UK Youth Climate Coalition, we tried to enable like the more diverse voices, the voices that were directly impacted by climate impacts, but didn't have even a voice at the table. And so last year that the Young Climate Conference was supposed to have taken place in Chile, at the very last second to move the conference to a different country. And the issue with this was, yes, that's not really much of an issue for like big NGOs or people, I guess the corporations which have like millions of dollars, But the issue with that is that the individuals, the local volunteers, the community groups, the activists based in areas which were being directly impacted by pollution had to save up for a long time, or like raise funds to be able to actually make the journey. And so what we did was raise enough funds to get, it was just one single activist, but that one activist mattered, like getting that one voice in that kind of space does matter, from Engajamando, or the Brazilian youth climate group. So particularly with the Amazon on fire at the time, and seeing like the huge like impact with Jair Bolsonaro in power, and seeing like the huge threat that he has posed in terms of climate, in terms of indigenous lives there, and seeing that particularly at that time, a time where there's huge protests erupting everywhere, huge levels of injustice and oppressions that are being exposed and challenged, and seeing that it was essential to have at least one person, at least getting one individual in that same space in the building, and being able to share their stories directly of how they've directly been impacted, and their own challenges to the solutions that often have no like basis in justice or equity or the reality of what people face on the ground. There's so many different ways in terms of making a space more inclusive and more diverse, but sometimes it's just as practical as getting somebody's present in a space as well. Say that as individuals we do have the power to make change collectively. I'd say if there's only one thing that you want to do to get more involved is, if you're based in the UK, is to challenge the hostile environment policy, stand up for migrants' rights and justice, as all of these issues are interconnected. So we have a person in a position of power who suggests the idea of, I guess, more or less quarantining people that are coming across the channel to seek refuge within the UK, off in this island, like, I don't know, maybe 400 miles away, like a ridiculous distance away, and more or less imprisoning them on this kind of island. So we have those kind of, those are suggested as like genuine solutions to an issue that they've made up of the idea of people invading and kind of escape and coming to this country, but seeing that actually like these issues are deeply connected in terms of the harms that people are exposed to, understanding that what people are trying to flee, like if they see that trying to cross the body of water in an unsafe vessel is that's a viable, that's the better alternative, and it's worth the risk of drowning at sea to try to cross, to kind of consider what they're trying to escape from, and don't allow the don't keep consuming like tabloid newspapers, which their go-to means of deflecting people's attention from whatever current mess the government has gotten itself into, is to scapegoat migrants and refugees. Even in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, the images that they constantly use and saying that, okay, the cases are rising. And so two Muslim women with a headscarf and a mask are the ones that are plastered on these on the front lines of these newspapers, on articles showing that actually like these cases are rising, we need greater lockdown measures, for example. In no other case would they use these images. They'd say, oh, we have no like diverse images of stock to use if it's an article of something positive. It's only in terms of the negative connotation that they're trying to associate with these images, that's when they decide to use them. So I guess it's seeing that this discussion is around beyond the climate bubble, so recognize that when you're trying to get involved within climate activism, go beyond that bubble. Don't seek yourself as limited, saying that, okay, is it directly related to nature or like conservation, or is it directly related to like something around a climate policy, or rather is it anything relating to the wider social justice issues, and there's undoubtedly something in your local community that you can get involved in already set up. So I guess join in that. That we need a just recovery that centres people and a livable planet as the bare minimum, and also in saying that if the virus, the pandemic has taught us just one thing, is that the virus operates beyond borders, and likewise any solutions, like for example the idea of a Green New Deal or like a green recovery, it needs to be internationalist in nature, because we don't operate in a silo as the United Kingdom. It's the fact that even in terms of industry, where we source resources to fund those industries and the like, it's all a very global and very interconnected world, and so our solutions, if they're going to be genuine, need to reflect that as well.